Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're glad to have you. My name is Paul O'Neill. On behalf of Kingston's Buried Treasures, we'd like to welcome you here to this month's presentation. And it's great to see everybody barreling through the storm to get here. That's why I said today that it's going to take more than 10 feet of snow to keep our local historians from coming here. So welcome, we're glad to have you, and it's always nice to see the fighting spirit of everybody here. Our subject tonight is the McEntees, and the title is The McEntees, Kingston's First Family, and that's very appropriate. The McEntees were an unbelievably diverse and talented family, much like the O'Neills. And we're very, very fortunate tonight to have as our feature presenter Lowell. Most people who are, if you're familiar and involved with the local historical community, I'm sure you know Lowell. Lowell has been around and contributing for many, many years. In fact, Lowell is currently working on a book about the McEntees and the families who lived on West Chestnut Street. If you're not familiar with Kingston, West Chestnut Street is down right before you get down to Lower Broadway and the Strand. It's where those beautiful, beautiful homes are. It's where really the creme de la creme of Kingston were. And the McEntees are really the anchor there. So Lowell is currently working on a book on West Chestnut Street. The name is going to be The Street That Built the City. And it's a very appropriate name. That will be forthcoming from Black Dome Press next year, 2015. So keep an eye out for that. That's going to be a wonderful book. So without further ado, it is a great honor to be able to welcome our featured presenter, Lowell Thing.
Thank you, Paul. When my wife and I moved to Kingston 40 years ago, we moved into a large, older house on West Chestnut Street. It had 10 rooms, but it was a mere cottage compared to the houses on the other side of the street. As most of you probably know, and as Paul has just said, these had been the homes of the owners or managers of the transportation or brickmaking industries of the 19th century. When I began to research the people who lived in these houses, I learned that the first person to live on the street, the man who, with his wife, Sarah, owned most of the property originally, who probably actually built the street itself, and who laid it out in lots, was James McEntee. James McEntee is better known, for those people who do know him, for having designed and supervised construction of the island dock down in the Rondout Creek. Many people are more familiar with his son, Jervis, the Hudson River School landscape painter. But there are other notable members of the family, and I'm going to cover them briefly too. The image you see here of James McEntee is the only one that I'm aware of. It's in Sylvester's History of Ulster County, 1880. So probably he was in his upper 70s at the time. Eastman Johnson, a well-known genre painter, painted a portrait of him in his later years, but unfortunately that painting hasn't been located. I made this montage in an attempt to suggest some of the different personalities, occupations, and events that affected the McEntees, such as the Civil War. James was a man of many occupations, as you'll see, and to a somewhat lesser extent, so was his brother Charles. We could look at their century as divided into, rather neatly, into two eras. Era number one, up to 1850, would represent the family's energy and opportunism at a time when the nation was building and expanding rapidly. Era two, the era of the second generation, 1850 to 1900, which had grown up in more affluent circumstances and received a somewhat better education, would reflect the latter part of the century and a nation that was developing a more sophisticated culture. But what is, whoops. what is Edwin Booth doing here? And what is Mrs. Custer's, who is supposed to be there, but isn't on this version of the foil? But anyway, the widow of Custer's last stand. We'll talk about both of them also. I speak of them as one family, but actually it's James and his brother Charles, both of whom came very early to the new village of Rondout. And these are their family members. I'm going to tell you a little bit about every one of those people, and also a little bit about Calvert Vaux, who I consider a member of the family. He married Jervis's sister Mary, and was very much, and Rondout was very much his second home, and he's buried in Montrepose. Many of the activities of the McEntees, which otherwise would not be available for us to know, are revealed in a journal that James' son Jervis kept for 18 years, from 1872 to 1890. This journal, which provides wonderful glimpses into the McEntees family life, is now available on the web, and you could easily find it by simply entering Jervis McEntee Journal. In fact, just his name would probably do it. It is through one of the entries in this journal that we can know where the McEntees came from. They were Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, who incidentally were also, like the Catholic Irish, of Celtic Gaelic-speaking origin, but had ended up in lowland Scotland, and then were induced in the 17th century to come back to free or very cheap land in Northern Ireland by the English, who wanted to balance the Catholics with Protestants. James' grandfather, Matthew, is said to have been a prosperous farmer in County Monaghan. I think you see the arrow there pointing to County Monaghan. Two of his sons, John and Philip, were members of a revolutionary group called the United Irishmen. When they were found to possess, when they were found with guns, they were transported to a penal colony in Tasmania. That's that island south of Australia. But with another brother's help, Thomas, they ended up in Delaware. A little later, in 1794, their brother Charles, this would be James' father, came to this country with his wife Mary, and they must have brought some money with them because they apparently were able to buy a boarding house in New York City. But somehow not long after that, they ended up in upstate New York near a place called Herkimer. That's not too far from present-day Utica. And in 1800, James was born, which is a very handy date for a historian, because during any event in the 19th century, I know exactly how old James was. Anyway, they lost the farm and ended up doing salt mining at nearby Onondaga Lake. They were there for several years, and then in 1 week, the family was almost swept away. The parents died, one of the sons died. James was very ill. He was 8 years old, and his brothers and a sister were orphaned and then farmed out to uncles and neighbors. And he grew up with his Uncle John and another squire, nearby squire. All the children seem to have had an education, farming in the summer and schooling in the winter. When James was 19, he was lucky enough to live near where the Erie Canal was being surveyed and planned out. He managed to get a job on a surveying team for the portion of the Erie Canal that was close to his home. In the winter of that year and the year following, he continued going to school. He must have been liked by the engineers that he worked with because he was rehired for the next 5 years to work on the Erie and feeder canals into it, and also on the Union Canal in Pennsylvania. That's a canal from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. Of course, there wasn't any photography in 1819, so that picture there is just for effect. From 1820 to 24, we could say that James became an engineer. You became an engineer on the job in those days. The first engineering schools in the country were West Point, which had its first class in 1812, but there wasn't another engineering school until RPI graduated a class in 1835. So almost all of America's engineers for the first 50 years were people who learned practical skills. They did have textbooks, but they learned as they did. We know that, let's see, he worked on this section canal from, let's see, the place Amsterdam to Big Nose is right around there. He worked from Utica to Montezuma, that stretch there. He also worked on what's called the Oswego Canal. A number of years later, he worked on the Chenango Canal as an engineer. And then in 1825, he's now 25 years old, he arrived in Kingston to begin work on the D&H Canal as an assistant engineer to John B. Jervis, who would later become known as America's first engineer. He arrived with his wife, a new wife of about 6 months. She was pregnant. Her name was Mary Swan. She came from his hometown. And since there were only a few homes down on the Rondout, he stayed in the village of Kingston. And if that house looks familiar, it is the Senate House. It was then owned by a Sarah Van Gaspeek. So he lived in the Senate House when he first got here. But in January of the following year, his wife died in childbirth, both she and the baby, and they were buried back home in Western. And shortly thereafter that, he moved out of the Senate House to some other location. In 1826, he became he was designated resident engineer. He was responsible for the building of the canal from Tidewater for the first 20 miles toward Port Jervis. Later in life, he could recall the names of all the landowners along the canal, all of whom he met and knew personally. He and the other engineers got around on horseback and by horse and wagon. At one point along the canal, near High Falls, he identified some limestone that could be used to make cement for use in the canal, and he arranged for its manufacture locally. One writer suggests this was the first discovery for what became known as Rosendale cement. Then in 1828, the D&H Canal opened officially, and the first coal came through. And of the first 10 boats that came through, 3 of them were owned by James and several others by his brother Charles. In 1827, James had remarried, this time to Sarah Gochius, who was the daughter of Henry Gochius, a minister of the Huguenot Church in New Paltz. And their first son, Jervis, was probably born in the building that would become the first Mansion House Hotel. By 1828, his brother Charles had arrived from upstate, and perhaps with James' help, he had based on this ad here, which is from the Rondout Courier. It's a Rondout newspaper. I'm not sure it's the Rondout Courier. In 1828, he had become partners in a dry goods and general store kind of business that also owned a line of sloops and a line of canal boats, according to the ad. Charles was only 22 years old, so it seems like he must have had his brother's help. From this point on, James and Charles and their families would live near each other, and in many ways, as best I can tell from reading Jervis's journal, they would seem like one larger family. In 1830, the attraction of mining coal was too strong for James, and so he resigned from the canal company, and he contracted with them to use the canal for coal that he would mine at the other end of the canal. Later, he claimed to be the first to dig underground in an area where initially you could just dig up the anthracite from the ground surface. But he indicates that his family stayed back in Rondout, and he was also buying some properties during this time, from some of them from the canal company that was trying to develop the village so that there would be housing and so forth. In 1832, James became a hotel keeper. Probably the house that he was living in, which had been purchased, it was a stone house owned by William Swart, whose property the canal company had purchased in 1825. And apparently James and his wife had lived there. In 1832, he bought the property from the canal company. Probably he and his wife managed it. And it was there that in 1830 his daughter was born. And in 1832 he acquired the property and began to call it the Mansion House. It may have been called that before, but that's not clear. He did sell the property in 1838, but he bought it back, and he was clearly living in it in 1845. He would later say that the family had lived in the Mansion House Hotel for 14 years altogether, and most of their children were born and raised in the Mansion House. From 1833 to 44, he went back to engineering. He worked on the Chenango Canal for a while. It was during this time, I believe, that the family moved closer to that work, and then later on returned to Rondout. In 1837, he built the first Rondout lighthouse. Not this one, this is a later one. The first one was made of wood, and he built a dock for it, and he built docks for these Saugerties and Esopus Meadows lighthouses. In 1839, he built a dam at Eddyville for the canal company. And then in 1844, another occupation for James, he got the contract for the towing business for the canal company on the Hudson. This is before the Cornell Steamboat Company. And unfortunately, he was the captain in charge of the steamboat Victory when it was wrecked at Yonkers. Apparently, the boat had been rammed while it was in New York Harbor. He hadn't been told about that. And so when the boat began to take on water around Yonkers, they had to head for shore. This is from Donald Ringwald, author of Steamboats for Rondout. Ringwald wrote that when the boat, which was leaking badly, was steered to shore, the only person injured in the mishap was Captain McEntees, who fell down in the general confusion. The boat was beyond repair, and it was dismantled afterward, and we don't hear anything further about Captain McEntees as a boat commander. And then in 1845, he got a contract from the canal company to build the island dock. I've seen a map dated 1831 that showed what we usually call a flats, or I think Ed Ford indicated to me one time there had been a sandbar in the middle of the creek, and that's what he built up into an island. All around it, it has a pile dock, a dock that in later years James would claim was the first pile dock built in New York State and perhaps the nation. Some of the piles driven to a depth of 60 feet, according to that article in a local newspaper circa 1880. James hired his brother Philip and his son Jervis to work on that project. The children of both James and Charles, James and Sarah, I should say, and Charles and Christina. Charles had married a local girl, Christina Tremper, went to the upstate to the Clinton Liberal Institute, probably because their uncles were nearby, and also it was a school with a very good reputation. Clara Barton later went there, and as did Grover Cleveland. The buildings you see there are from an early brochure. There was a separate school for men and for women. Jervis kept a journal for 2 years while he was at school, and he mentions studying Latin, French, chemistry, and public speaking. In March of 1845, Jervis, he was called Jetty in the family, by the way, and his father came home down the Hudson on the steamship South America. And this is an excerpt from what he entered in his school journal. He was 16 years old. About 9 o'clock, Kingston baggage struck on my ears, and it was indeed a welcome sound. Soon the bell rang, and the boat came alongside the dock, and we once more stepped upon the soil of old Ulster. Calvin was there with his team, and we rode home. Pa told Calvin to drive slowly up to the back piazza, but our folks were on watch, and Mary Ann was on the piazza by the time we got there. As soon as she found out that we were there, she ran in, I suppose, to carry the news to Ma. We went through the bar room and the sitting room, and when we got to the head of the stairs, we met Ma and Mary Ann, which is one of the ways we know that they were living in the mansion house at the time. I mean, most houses don't have a bar room. In 1848, James built the property that would, on which West Chestnut Street would be built. And I'll also, on this, I think you can see, it says property of James F. McEntee. And you can see that on this 1851 map that he has laid it out in lots. And also, right there, that was the property of his brother Charles. And it looks like maybe, based on where that's located, that he built the barn first, because that's about where a barn was located later. But apparently by 1851, they had built a house and moved into it, because that's when the taxes went up considerably. And who the family was, as you see on this slide, as follows. Jervis was still living at home, 23, working locally, probably with in his Uncle Charles' flour and feed business. The younger members of the family were still, except for Mary, still in school part-time, and most of them, as best I've been able to determine, also went to school up at the Clinton Liberal Institute. And likely there were 2 recently immigrated Irish girls, because the later censuses for the family show that there usually were 2 servants and sometimes a farm laborer. And this is the homestead from a sketch that Jervis did one spring day in 1880 as a gift for his sister Lucy, who was out west at the time. And the sketch shows some family members. It's mentioned in his journal. You can see the architecture is Italianate with a wide roof bracket, sometimes referred to as Hudson River bracketed. The house seems to be stuccoed. We know from his journal that he once painted the house with linseed oil, which he thought brought out the color. He painted it all by himself. And if you look through the trees, you might see a little bit of Jervis's studio that I'm going to talk about in a minute. Look right through there, I think you see a chimney and a roof line. In 1850, Jervis, who had had no formal art education, was able to show a landscape at the National Academy in New York. He was only 22 years old. In the following winter of 1850-51, he took lessons down in the city with Frederick Edwin Church, himself only 2 years older, but already considered to be the heir perhaps to Thomas Cole. In an interview much later, he told the interviewer that he'd always been interested in drawing and painting. And that first quote there is from that interview, in which he said, "Since my earliest recollection, I have had studios in our garrets and carriage houses." Church went in for the grand effect, sometimes we call that the sublime, and McEntees' art was at the opposite end of the spectrum. He went in for the contemplative woodland scene. Nevertheless, Church and McEntee would be lifelong friends and often exchange visits. The photograph was recently found in his wife's family, identified as Jarvis McEntee with a question mark, but it seems to compare well with other photographs, and it was taken in Utica, which is kind of a clue, since that was only 8 miles from the Clinton Academy. In 1853, perhaps with the financial help of his parents, he chose an architect who was then practicing in Newburgh to design a live-in studio for him. It would be on the homestead property next to the main house. The architect was Calvert Vaux, then newly arrived from England, where he had grown up and studied architecture. Calvert must have hit it off very well with his new client and his family, because within a year, he was married to Jervis's sister, Mary. And meanwhile, Jervis himself had met the woman of his dreams in Gertrude Sawyer, the daughter of Thomas Sawyer, the Universalist minister who had been the principal at Jervis's school at the Clinton Institute. Gertrude was 6 years younger than Jervis. He was just 20 when they were married. The illustration is from the book that Calvert Vaux wrote in 1857 called Villas and Cottages. Jervis and Gertrude were married down in the city, and as soon as they came back, they lived in this house. The studio was later expanded. Vaux's book shows the house as it would look when completed, and a later map suggests that the studio cottage was completed pretty much as it was drawn here. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to tell you what happened to the studio and where it is now. Calvert Vaux had been trained as an architect in England, and he was especially influenced by the Gothic Revival style. He came to the country at the invitation of Andrew Jackson Downing, a popular landscape architect and author of influential books on domestic architecture. Vaux worked with Downing less than 2 years, and then after Downing's tragic death in a steamboat accident down the river, he took over his practice. Calvert and Jervis would become lifelong friends, and in time, the McEntee homestead would become his second home. And this pair of gouaches are owned by a member of the McEntee family and said to have been done by Jervis as a wedding gift. Jervis was never a portraitist as such. He had no formal training in it, but we do know that it was a facility that he continued to work on most of his life. Here's another picture of Mary, undated. This is from the Sawyer family, the family of Jervis's wife Gertrude. The photograph looks like it's made in the 1850s or 1860s, no later. To give you just a few slides on Calvert Vaux, who very much deserves his own presentation, you may already know that he was the co-designer of both Central Park and Prospect Park in New York, along with Frederick Law Olmsted. Vaux is one of the most frequently mentioned names in Jervis's journal. With his wife, he owned property on Chestnut Street, and there is no question that the homestead and Rondout were his second home. He's buried with other members of the family in the family plot in Montrepose. Just to mention a few of the works that he did here, the Hoyt House is undergoing restoration, trying to raise money to restore it across the river in Statsburg. You can see it if you go visit the Mills Mansion and walk on the grounds. Here is one of the Gothic Revival style bridges from that Vaux designed for Central Park. And here are two houses that are still on, still exist, and they're on West Chestnut Street. That's 48 West Chestnut and 194. I'm sure you're familiar with them. He helped church design Olana. This is the Warren House in Newburgh, Beechwood in Newport, Rhode Island, and this is was an industrial school in New York City. In the 1850s, Jervis continued to work locally to develop his art, and in 1858 he made the big break. He joined the full-time members of what later came to be called the Hudson River School, who were working in a studio building in New York. His wife Gertrude went with them. In 1861 he was elected an academician at the National Academy of Design, a sure sign that he had arrived. It was also the beginning of the Civil War, and we'll come back to Jervis's career after the war. In 1861, Jervis and his brothers Maurice and Gerard had signed up as volunteers for a 3-month enlistment, because once the war started, the government suddenly felt a need to guard the nation's capital. And so they went down and mostly bivouacked around Maryland near Washington, D.C. After serving the 3-month period, the men came back home, and the militia, which locally was known as the Ulster Guard, was reformed as the 120th New York State Regiment. For whatever reasons, Jervis chose not to sign up again. He was a bit older than his brothers and cousins, and he was married. He was making progress as an artist. He was also now the family's primary breadwinner. Having served initially, he was in a position to say that he had served. His brother Maurice, 9 years younger, served in both the infantry and the Navy during the war. He also went off and served that 3-month period, but after he got back, he re-enlisted in the Navy and served as an acting master on a blockader under Admiral Farragut. An acting master was basically the person who did the navigation on the blockaders. The blockaders were steamboats, and the object was to keep the South from, really basically to starve the South. Maurice was 9 years younger than Jervis and a promising writer who had stories published as Uncle Blue Jacket in Our Young Folks magazine. He was, and he also later worked as a reporter on the Kingston Freeman. He was the unfortunate victim of alcoholism, a constant temptation in Rondout, where almost every other merchant downtown offered some form of spirits, grocery stores. You could get a drink anywhere. The family went downtown with him to temperance meetings, but it never worked. He died when he was 47. Gerard went off with the 20th New York State Militia as its drummer boy, age 13. The pistol you see there, he has a gun and a pistol. You can see the pistol. My wife wanted to know where the drum was. After the war, he didn't re-enlist. He got a job in a printing press factory in Brooklyn, and by 1876 he had returned to Rondout, married, and he built a house at 99 West Chestnut Street that we're going to come back to in a minute. Jervis's cousin John McEntee played a small but important role in the Civil War. Gettysburg is usually considered one of the war's turning points, and it was John McEntee's work as an intelligence officer that ultimately determined where the battle was fought, and perhaps even that it was fought at all. In 1861, he had entered the war as a quartermaster sergeant, and he worked his way up to the rank of captain when his commanding officer, Colonel George Sharp, another Kingston man who had raised his own regiment, the 120th Militia, was a very astute and popular commander, another person about whom, if a presentation hasn't been done, probably should be, was given the job of being in charge of wartime intelligence. Colonel Sharp was, that is. And from his regiment, he selected John McEntee to be his second assistant. And John's job was to get fairly close to the enemy and send scouts out. As an officer, he wasn't supposed to go right up against the enemy, but his job was to send scouts out, have them report back, and evaluate what they had learned. Or for that matter, if there was someone who had defected from the other side, to evaluate whether they were really, whether they were a plant or not. So on one occasion, he was able to determine the location of Lee's forces and their direction of movement, and to set the Union forces marching north in parallel with them so that they would converge at Gettysburg and be able to get the higher ground, which made all the difference in the three-day battle. Lee lost a third of his forces. In the book where I read this story, by the way, I learned that at least one of his fellow officers liked to call him McEntee, or call him McEntee, call him McEntee. Anyway. This is the book. It's a fascinating book. All this information was unknown until the author of this book, about 10 or 15 years ago, discovered in the National Archives a lot of information about Civil War intelligence that no one had ever found. After the war, he came back to Rondout and he worked in his father's flour and feed business, and then he joined John Dillon as a partner in the Rondout Iron Works. He died in 1903. John's brother was not so fortunate. 6 months after going to the war, he died in camp of meningitis. A new estimation in 2012 of Civil War deaths arrived at a figure of 750,000. It's generally agreed that at least half of the deaths were from disease, mainly due to unsanitary camp conditions. Then in 1865, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. As you may know, John Wilkes Booth, brother Edwin, was, and I believe still is considered to be, one of the preeminent American actor of the 19th century. According to a new biography of Booth, He first met Jervis and Calvert in 1861 at a party held by the poet and critic Richard Stoddard and his wife. Edwin and Jervis, Edward, by the way, called Jervis after they came to know each other. He didn't call him Jetty, he called him Jervy. Somehow or other, it's a bit unnerving to think of one of your favorite painters as Jervy McEntees. Doesn't it sound? Would be friends, anyway, they would be friends for the rest of Booth's life and very close to other members of the family. He and his daughter Edwina visited the McEntees in Rondout several times, not necessarily in 1865, that's a little inaccurate, but he did visit the homestead a number of times. There is a story, apparently true, that when Lincoln ran for re-election, Booth told Jervis that he wanted to vote for Lincoln, but he'd never voted before. Had never had the time to vote, didn't know how to do it. And so Jervis and the editor of the Rondout Courier, whose name was John Hageman, managed to get him the papers to register and vote, and he did vote for Lincoln. And this story assumed a great deal of importance after the assassination, when Edwin needed to show everyone that he was horrified by what his brother had done, as was the entire Booth family, all of whom had been Union supporters. Augusta McEntee, Jervis's sister, married Joseph Tompkins, a part owner of the Newark Lyman Cement Company. And although they lived next to they lived on part of the homestead property for a short time, and in 1869 they moved away to New Brunswick, where Tompkins was part owner of a new cement project. In about 1865, Lucy, the youngest daughter, married Captain John Andrews, a career Army man, and followed him to a series of posts out west. It was through Lucy and the Andrews family, by the way, that I was able to locate the homestead oil sketch that I showed you earlier. Sarah was 9 years younger than Jervis. Jervis was very impressed with her achievement in a day when the conservative medical establishment simply couldn't imagine allowing men and women in medical school together. Therefore, there were no conventional women doctors until around the turn of the century. But alternative approaches to medicine did offer opportunities, and so Sarah chose this school in the city, the Eclectic Medical College in New York City, and this very pragmatic approach to medicine. The medical approach of using what are sometimes called heroic approaches, bloodletting, emetics such as mercury and percutives, had become very unpopular, to say the least. And so people were looking for new approaches like homeopathy and eclectic medicine. Sarah was in her early 30s when she entered the school, and I believe she attended for 3 or 4 years. I think that of all the siblings, Jervis and Sarah were the closest, based upon reading the journal. After Jervis's wife died, Sarah, who also lived in the homestead house, helped Jervis recover, and she sometimes came down to the city and straightened out his studio for him. Sarah, or Sade, as she was called in the family, probably tended him in his final illness. The daughters of Charles McEntee were Julia, Anna, and Lily. Of the 3 daughters, Julia, the eldest, is best known as a highly regarded painter of floral still lifes. At 38, Julia went to, she married John Dillon in 1866. Dillon was partners with her brother, John, in the Rondout Iron Works, which is the company that manufactured the ironwork storefronts that you see down on Lower Broadway. When she went to Europe at the age of 38 for a short time to study art, her passport describes her as being 5 foot 3 inches tall, with dark blue eyes, fair complexion, and small features, the photograph there is probably taken at about that time. I don't know much about Anna. She married Frederick Norton, who was in the cement business, in 1870. Lily also painted and showed her work. She married in 1883 and moved away to Montreal. Both of them are mentioned in the journal, and they as people, they were often part of family outings, picnics, and rides in the country. This is not very well shown here. In 1873, John Dillon died, and for a time she may have moved back to the house on East Chestnut. Their house was on East Chestnut, by the way. With her brother John McEntee now as her partner, she retained an interest in the McEntee and Dillon Iron Works and apparently took part in managing it. In the early 1880s, she moved to New York City, and she had a studio there. And this is probably the height of her career. She exhibited her work at the National Academy, at the Fine Art Institute of Chicago, and at the Pennsylvania Academy, among other places. She was also a proficient watercolorist. The Friends of Historic Kingston exhibited many of her works several years ago and published a catalog that you can still buy in the Friends of Historic Kingston museum store. And there are a lot of very, it's a good way to see her work. And these are photographs of her studio when she moved to uptown Kingston and lived in a stone house for many years. She was a founder of the Kingston Carnegie Library and very active in local gardening clubs. Getting back to Jervis and the studio where he lived and worked during the winter season each year, you see the 10th Street Studio building, which was designed expressly for artists by Richard Morris Hunt. Church, Bierstadt, and other leading artists of the day had studios there. It opened in 1857, and within a year, Jervis had rented a studio there and committed himself to full-time living as a painter. Unlike most of the tenants in the building, some of whom were bachelors, Jervis lived in the building with Gertrude. Their second-floor apartment included a bedroom, kitchenette, and sitting room. In the photograph you see, that's Jervis, somewhere in the center there. This is rather hard to see him, but he has this long black beard that blends in with the dark suit. So it's, just take my word for it, that's Jervis right in the center. Gertrude was about 24 when she and Jervis moved into the studio. She played the piano, and it was generally agreed she had a great deal of charm and social poise. She had been the daughter of a very well-known minister. As the only married couple in the building, their apartment often became a gathering place for many of the artists. She was later described by a family in-law as a brilliant woman and the especial favorite of the New York literary and artistic crowd that included Edwin Booth, Bayard Taylor, Whitlaw Reid, and so forth. This is a painting of Gertrude that is in her family, the Sawyer family. And I think it's the first time it's been shown outside the family. It is by Thomas Waterman Wood, who is a friend of Jervis's. It has a date, but we haven't been able to figure out what the date actually is. These are some of the people with whom Jervis and Gertrude exchanged letters. I suppose you might say this is part of their circle. They had dinner with these people, met at the Century Club or the Academy or the theater. The McEntees were avid theater goers. Jervis met the widow of General Custer, there she is, who had become a celebrity after writing her account of the life in army camps and a defense of her husband. And in the company of others, they had lunch and dinner several times and also exchanged visits and had long talks. Reading between the lines of the journal, which perhaps I shouldn't have done, there seemed to be a mutual attraction, but both were dedicated to the memories of their former spouses. See, there's Frederick Edmund Church. Bret Hart, the writer, wrote The Luck of Roaring Camp, something like that. Sanford Gifford, another Hudson River School painter with whom Jervis often went sketching. Eastman Johnson, another very close friend, as was the painter Worthington Whitridge. This was Clarence Stedman, a poet and critic. And this is Bram Stoker, who is the author of Dracula, by the way, and happened to be in the theater business and sometimes got tickets for the McEntees. Richard Stoddard, another poet. Bayard Taylor, who was a big man in the literary world around that time. He was a travel writer, poet, sort of a man of letters. And this was Doreen Wheeler, the daughter of Candace Wheeler, who was a member of the Tiffany Studio, sometimes called the mother of interior decoration, American. Jervis was a very active member of the National Academy, serving on its council for a number of years, and remembered later as one who was fairly resistant to change, outspoken about it. He sometimes helped hang the paintings for the Academy's annual exhibition. He was elected to the Century Association, that's their building, in 1862, and this was kind of a club that brought the artistic and literary community together. And if somebody like Sarah Bernhardt came to New York, they would be given a reception at the Century Association and everybody would get to meet them. It wasn't uncommon for Jervis and Gertrude to be there a couple of nights a week. Jervis was generally seen as a painter of autumn. It was the favorite time of year, it was his favorite time of year for painting, and he seems to have been very much at home outdoors. In his journal, he is always describing a walk he has just taken, sometimes with his dog Park, sometimes alone or with a friend. Partly because of his preference for autumn scenes, partly because his journal entries reflect disappointment with his income as a painter, he has acquired a reputation as a sort of melancholy painter. He had very strong ideas about what a painting ought to be, and in his later years, he saw the paintings of the Hudson River School being overtaken by new art movements. His autumn paintings could also be surprisingly optimistic. He himself wrote that I look upon a landscape as I look upon a human being. Its thoughts, its feelings, its moods are what interest me, and to these I try to give expression. I don't know if you can see this, but it says Woman, the title of this one is Woman at the Edge of the Woods. McEntee and some of his fellow artists at some point recognized that landscapes that included figures were more apt to sell. And this seems to be a painting that earlier in his career might not have included the figure. I'm still looking for a journal entry that would indicate who the model was for the woman with the walking stick, or whether he painted the woman in later, as they sometimes did. It couldn't have been Gertrude because she died in 1878. Or possibly it might have been a Gertrude that he recollected. Jervis did paint pictures in other seasons. This is probably a local scene, possibly on the Rondout. Now, this is really winter. Winter's Storm it's called, and that is a figure making toward that house with a light on there. Jervis did not understand Impressionism. In general, he found the work ugly, But in some of his later work, such as this one, to some extent, he seems to have been influenced by these new approaches to painting. He often sketched at different places in the Catskills, sometimes staying there for a few days, and he sometimes went on these sketching expeditions with Church or Gifford or other of his fellow artists. They also went to Maine, and McEntee produced a number of coastal scenes. In 1868, McEntee made a trip to Europe, during which he and his wife spent time with Frederick Church and his wife, and Sanford Gifford and his wife. They traveled to England and Italy, where Jervis probably made this painting, or the sketches for it. Now we're close to home. In fact, this one is a view from Jervis's studio toward the Catskills. And if you look closely, you can see the church spires of Kingston Village. This is a sketch that was on sale several years ago in a New York gallery, and Jervis mentions it in his journal as having been made from the McEntee homestead, looking toward Hussey Hill. Hussey Hill is that hill back of Port Ewan, with blooming apple trees in the foreground. And so apparently they had an orchard, and maps kind of indicate that on the back side of that property. So if you happen to be on Dietz Court, for example, and think about what's down below, this is part of, that's where these apple trees would have been. James McEntee listed himself in the 1850 census as a farmer, even though he continued to work as an engineer. He saw that the homestead plot, they did have a cow and a calf in the barn, and they had a horse or two, as you would have had to get around in those days. So to some extent, he saw his homestead, although it wasn't very large in terms of size, as a farm. Maybe this orchard was part of it. Well, here's that bird's eye view map that they sell in the Friends of Historic Kingston museum store. These maps were very popular around the late 1800s. There was a company that went around making them, and this one is doesn't have a date, but we can pretty much look place it at around 1885. And so let's see if we can find the McEntees on it. As you can see, this the lower part of it shows you the Rondout Creek, and here is Chestnut Street in the center. That says Chestnut, and there's the Chestnut Street. Here's the homestead area. There were other houses on it. By this time, they had sold off some lots, and you can see the house of Henry Sampson, that bluestone house that still exists today. The house of Abraham Crispell, the doctor, physician. And now we can see a close-up of the homestead property. And over here is, next to the homestead property, is the house of James Van Duzen. I forget his wife's name. And it's an entirely different house than the house that you see today as you go by that has the high tower on the corner. It's an identical place. That house was built over this house, apparently, in 1890. And here is the studio. Here's Jervis's studio house. There's the barn, the carriage house. That's the homestead house. And this was a house that Augusta and Joseph Tompkins built, and that later was sold to and was the home of Mr. Lindsley, the first, I can't remember his first name, who was the first mayor of the city of Kingston. That house is no longer there. In fact, none of these houses are there anymore except this one here, which is the house that Gerard McEntee built in about 1876 that we're going to show you in a minute. And you can kind of see that they had some some trees down here, and they also had a fence, which Jervis mentions in the journal when they went to sell the property in 1889. Well, James' wife Sarah died in 1883. James himself died in 1886. The rest of the family was somewhere else now except for Jervis and his sister Sarah. Jervis was feeling the burden of the house and they needed the money, so he auctioned off the homestead property. He held a public auction on the property one day in 1889. Not too many people came, so only a few lots were sold. The rest of the property was bought the following year, was sold the following year to Samuel and Mary Kirkendall. Jervis died in the homestead house on January 1891. Sarah lived on in the homestead house until she died in 1903, when the house was purchased and removed or torn down by the Kirkendalls. Jervis was 62 years old when he died. The Kirkendalls hired Calvert Vaux to design their new mansion. It was one of Vaux's last commissions. And this is the mansion in 1895, and it's built on the site, ironically, of one of Calvert Vaux's first commissions, the studio house. I believe you can see a portion of the homestead house in this photograph over there. It's the only photograph I know. There's one other photograph I know that has, in the far, far distance, a picture of the homestead house. Samuel Kirkendall, for those who are not aware who he was the son-in-law of Thomas Cornell, and by 1895 he had acquired full control of the Cornell Steamboat Company. Ed Ford gave a marvelous lecture on the Kirkendall family last summer. Time for it again. By the time this postcard appeared, probably about 1910, based on how far ivy has crept up the walls, the homestead house had been removed. People who used to play on the property tell me that where the homestead house had been, the Kirkendalls built a formal flower garden with a fountain. So this is the last McEntee house. Gerard and his wife built it in about 1876. This is a photograph from 1950. You can see there used to be a carriage stone there. That's not there anymore. And you can see it had been made into a duplex. There were with the awnings on one side, but not on the other. And these were the last McEntees on West Chestnut, or some of them. Some of their children were there. Let's see, we have by name James, Jansen, Gerard Jr., Dwight, and Florence. And Dwight's son, Dwight Jr., carried on the insurance business that Gerard had started. Gerard Jr. Became a fairly well-known history professor at West Point, a career Army man who wrote a definitive history of World War I. So when Dwight Jr. sold the house in 1951 and moved away, it was almost exactly 100 years after the McEntees had arrived. Well, this is what happened to Jervis's studio. One of the last entries in Jervis's journal says that Gerard has purchased my studio from Sam Kirkendall and is moving it over to his house. So some, if not all, of the studio house was moved to create that side of the house and also a rear addition. Today, the house is being restored by Aaron and Sari Ruff. They've uncovered some of the original structure inside, where you can see the difference between the 1875 side and the earlier 1853-54 side. Other than this house, there isn't much left of the McEntees on Chestnut Street. Still, Aaron Ruff did manage to find several things inside the walls of the house. William DeWitt, who wrote A History of Kingston, said that Gerard was noted for his brains and personality and his natty dress in an English style with exceptionally striking and attractive vests. He never mentioned detachable shirt cuffs. In taking down the walls inside, Aaron found a number of fragments of the McEntee era. He found a detachable shirt cuff. I had never heard of such a thing, but they were popular beginning in around 1875, so that you didn't have to wash the whole shirt. You could just wash the cuff, and they also had detachable collars. This one was made by a company in Troy, New York, and you can see the initials, J.S. McKee and G.L. Muck. And so it appears that with everything else the McEntees were, they were also a very practical and very thrifty family. This removable shirt cuff was passed down from father to son. And so, in this limited time, we come to the end of the McEntees, at least of their reign on West Chestnut Street, and a way for us to revisit the 19th century. And now, as a sort of fitting ending, I'd like to introduce two people who helped out with my presentation. A living McEntee, Andrewette McEntee Sutton. Andrewette, would you stand? And Joan Morris, whose late husband, Robert Morris, was also a descendant of Gerard and Mary McEntee. Joan? Thank you. And a special thanks to some of these people here. That's it. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Lowell was pretty detailed, so I think he answered most of the questions that I certainly could have answered.
Was the last house designed by Calvin Watts? The last house that they moved the studio to? Was that a Calvin Watts home?
The studio was, yes.
No, the last house, the 99. Yeah. Where it's at in the Ruxton? Yes. It's a Calvin Watts house?
Yeah, that was part, as Lowell said, part of the studio was moved over there, and the studio was designed by Calvert Vaux. Well, Lowell, thank you. Thank you very much. That was very interesting, and this was a very difficult topic because many of the McEntees are a subject in and of themselves. To be able to take the entire family and put it together the way Lowell did, it was amazing. And I'll tell you, I had the pleasure of going with Lowell on the radio a couple weeks ago, and in the 10 minutes that we were waiting to go on, Lowell was talking a little bit about the McEntees, and we never got beyond the beginning of James. It was, and you know, I thought I knew something about the McEntees, and it was unbelievable. So it was absolutely wonderful. And Lowell, thank you so much. It is so difficult to take these things and put them together the way they do, and to keep it as entertaining and to touch on everybody. And Lowell did a beautiful job. So Lowell, thank you, and thank you, Lowell, for putting together the book. Again, the book is going to be The Street That Built the City on West Chestnut Street. And the stories on West Chestnut Street, this is one family on West Chestnut. The stories they're incredible, and they're really a part of our legacy. So I'm looking forward to that book coming up. Hopefully everyone will get it when it does, because I'm sure it is going to be excellent. Lowell's done an unbelievable amount of work on this, so we're really looking forward to it. And Lowell, thank you again. And again, we'd like to thank the people who do make this possible. I'm not going to go through everybody. Everybody at the Senate House really does a great job. They welcome us here to have this, so we really appreciate that. We'd like to let them know. All the members of Kingston's Buried Treasures put in a lot of effort. It takes a lot to put this on, and everybody does a great job. And Joe Tantillo, again, Joe is Joe designs everything and puts in a lot of effort for that. We've Ed Ford, Pat Murphy, Nina Posipak is in here, and Tom Hafe is in here. Pat is here. And Pat actually, was that postcard of the Kirkendall Mansion, was that from your grandfather?
Yes.
Yeah. Pat's grandfather had a postcard company, so many of the postcards that you see of Old Kingston were from Pat's grandfather. And Pat actually told me some stories about playing in the Kirkendall Mansion as a child, too. I'd love to it would have been wonderful to be able to do that. Bob Rizzo, again, Bob does all the videos. There is a list in the back. This is actually our 17th presentation. So we've really covered some incredible people. And Bob does a wonderful job with the videos. And he has copies. If you want them, you can contact him in the back, and he has a list. If you put down your information and which one you want, he has a list of the past ones. He'll be happy to do that. So we thank him, and we thank his better half, Gene, who brings some of the wine here. So we've gotten compliments. And while we're doing that, JK Wine and Liquor, we want to thank them. They're very generous. They provide the wine here. As I've said before, I told them that we were all alcoholics, so please don't make a liar out of me. If you're going to get a bottle of wine, think about stopping down there. Again, all the people who really publicize this event as well. Many of you here are here because you heard of it through some of these people. Again, Hugh Reynolds always does a wonderful workup, and Hugh was publicizing this event before it was an event. So we thank Hugh, Jillian Fisher, Friends of Historic Kingston, Vivian Wadland's here. She helps us out, putting it in her publication and on her website. Chester Hartwell, Walt Wachowski, Kingston Community Radio, Kingston Happenings, Ulster County Tourism. We want to thank all those people. They really do a great job, and we want to thank all of you. Again, as we always say, we continue to do this because of you. It's so great to see everybody here month after month and the interest you've all shown in our community and the history of our community. It's a great community event, and it really brings all of us together. And we're so proud of that, and we're proud of that because of you, and especially coming through a night like tonight, fighting through traffic. It really, you're pioneer stock, each and every one of you. I do want to talk about our upcoming presentations. Next month, March 21st, Gary Schussler, and Gary is here, he's in the back, is going to do a presentation on Kingston we had originally discussed Kingston in the Civil War, but Gary is going to narrow it down to Kingston in the Battle of Gettysburg. For those of you who aren't aware, Kingston had an incredibly important role. We have John McEntees. The Battle of Gettysburg probably doesn't happen if it isn't for John McEntees. George Sharp was also part of that. But the Ulster 20th and the Ulster 120th both played incredibly important roles in the Battle of Gettysburg, and Gary's going to talk to us about that. And then on April 11th, the Old Dutch Church, the church that sculpted Kingston, Rob Sweeney, who was one of the elders at the Old Dutch Church, is going to talk to us about the Old Dutch Church. When you talk about Kingston, really the two cornerstones of Kingston are the Senate House and the Old Dutch Church. So that's going to be an interesting talk as well. Speaking of the Old Dutch Church, I just want to remind everybody, tomorrow night is the 91st annual George Washington dinner. It is always a wonderful time and a wonderful meal. It's going to be particularly entertaining this year because it's really the Ed Ford dinner. All the proceeds are going to the Ed Ford Lunette Project, so we hope you can make it. Again, it's always a wonderful meal. We thank everybody for coming, and Lowell, thank you so much. A wonderful presentation. We'll see you next month, everyone.